So I'm going to go ahead and get started. Our topic today is behavior studies and transit. And it's always a subject that interests me. But I think with the pandemic, it interests me even more because when I think about public health, one of the major tools, hi Chuck, thanks for joining us. One of the major tools in public health is managing human behavior and encouraging human behavior to sort of stem the tide of epidemics and that sort of thing. So it's really important to understand human behavior anytime you're designing something for the public, whether it's a building or a park or a program. It's an important element of, I think, any kind of public design, and certainly important in the field of public transit. And so as right now, I'd mentioned before to our presenters, a couple of the questions that really stand out for us at VIA is, well, number one of our goals is to reduce, in concert with the City of Boulder and Boulder County, to reduce our the carbon footprint of our transit vehicles and transit in general. And so toward that end, we are in the process of designing a microgrid that we'll be building in the near future. And that will allow us to capture solar energy through solar panels, store it in backup batteries, and use that to charge a fleet of electric hop vehicles and some paratransit vehicles. And that's all really great. But really the greatest impact we can have with that kind of environmentally sustainable transit is if more people use public transit. So how do we, use behavioral studies to help us convince more people to leave their single occupant cars and participate in public transit? So those are kind of the overarching goals and ideas about why we are interested in looking at behavioral studies. So what I want to do first is I will ask our three speakers to introduce themselves and to give us kind of a specific idea of where their studies are. Behavior science is a very, very broad area. So obviously, when we talk about it in the context of public transit, it's not the whole realm of behavior science, but it's very specific areas and issues. So I'm going to start with Alana Wilson and have her introduce herself and identify the areas of behavior studies that she focuses on.
Sure, thanks a lot, Lisa, and thanks, VIA, for having us. I have been a long time affiliate of the CU Boulder community, first as a student and then for a while as a staff person working on campus transportation issues. I also now have an appointment at the National Renewable Energy Lab. And in terms of behavior, a lot of the work that I do focuses on mode choice and how people make the choice to take the mode that they do to get around. And one of the elements of behavior that I've been tracking recently is the application of behavioral economics in influencing mode choice.
Could you explain quickly what you mean by behavioral economics?
Sure, just the role of economics and our value of dollars and or time and or other values that can influence our decisions in ways that may not be apparent or obvious at first blush.
Thanks. So I'm going to go to Shankari now and ask her to tell us a little bit about her research areas too.
So I just graduated from UC Berkeley with a PhD in computer science and a designated emphasis in global metropolitan studies. So my work is very interdisciplinary. And I don't actually do studies, but what I do is I build the tools that allow other researchers to do studies. So I recently, as part of my PhD thesis, I built a platform to collect people's travel patterns using smartphone background sensing, and then some analysis to actually figure out what their travel diaries are and so on. And then to combine that sensed data with surveyed data, and then to potentially allow people to change the UI so that you can actually try to influence behavior as opposed to just measure it. So there were some undergraduates I worked with who built a UI on top of the platform that I built to compare emotion and information in incentivizing sustainable transportation. I can tell you more about that if you want, but that's sort of roughly what it is. So I'm a computer science person, but what I do is I build the tools that allow the behavior scientists like Alana and Andy to actually go out and do these studies without having to write code, hopefully.
Great, thank you. So Andy, it's your turn.
Sure, thanks. I guess I'll begin by saying I'm a behavioral scientist by training, an anthropologist prior to that, but I'm cross-literate in multiple fields. I work primarily with data scientists, engineers, computer scientists, but I've also served as an advisor in the policy realm, and understand the planning to a variety of degrees. Just thinking about how I got into making the connection between behavior and mobility branches back to being a Peace Corps volunteer in Central Asia about 25 years ago. I grew up in rural Wyoming where, other than a horse, there's really only one mode to get around. And transit never entered the picture. When I was in the Peace Corps, I realized that I was more or less in the Wyoming of Central Asia, a country called Kyrgyzstan, where there's a lot of cattle. It's a fairly rural setting, a lot of mountains, but almost no one owned a car. And so mobility options were dramatically different, even in a fairly familiar type of setting. While I was there, I never encountered a bus that didn't have room for 1, 2, or 5 more people, or things that were transported on motorcycles or bicycles were just astonishing to me. And so when I came back to the US after that experience, I really began to think about how we are very focused on just a few modes and very limited uses of those modes in comparison to other locations in the world. And so that's kind of inspired me to throughout my career, make those linkages, try to identify places where people can be shifted toward making choices that are both more environmentally friendly, but also more convenient and more practical for their real needs. I worked in the development of some of the first bike sharing systems in the US, one of those being in Denver. I helped set up a temporary system for the 2008 Democratic National Convention, advised and was appointed as a board of directors member for Denver B-Cycle, and I advised Boulder B-Cycle in their development, and focused on that interaction between shared, kind of this emergent shared spectrum of modes and the connection to more traditional transit. And over the course of my work, I've started to view transit as needing to be somewhat more kind of reinvented or reimagined as times are changing. That's happened more so in private vehicles than it has in transit vehicles. And so I think we're at a kind of a precipice where we can start to make some some changes that can help to make transit more appealing to people by satisfying their need for mobility and in either more convenient or even fun manner. This was, of course, prior to COVID-19 emergence, which has colored a lot of our work since then. But I think that we're in a great time for opportunities to use tools like Shankari has developed to gain insight into people's behaviors and to identify those leverage points where they may be shifted toward more desirable outcomes and more convenience from the point of view of individuals. So that's not a very short introduction, but I wanted to make sure that I conveyed some sort of background as well as part of my involvement here.
Oh, thanks. That's great. You know, something Andy just said reminded me of one of the questions that somebody suggested for that I think Zoe suggested, which is, I'd like to ask the three of you, how do you anticipate COVID-19 and possible future pandemics will affect the future of public transit? Maybe I could start with Alana again.
Sure. I think what comes to mind first and foremost, I don't know if folks, some of you I'm sure more than others, track the news about transit and transit ridership and what's happened. But, you know, other than knowing that transit across the country, ridership has dropped 70 to 90%. For me, the transit app, who uses the transit app or has it or knows about it? So the transit app did a survey of their app users in April, sort of after the transit ridership numbers plummeted, and they looked at who's still riding transit, like who are the transit dependent folks who are still out there getting on our buses. And they found that like pre-COVID, it was about 50-50 gender split, and after COVID, it was closer to 60% females. And overwhelmingly, it was white people who had stopped using transit and people of color who are still on the bus. And from their survey, they say 70% of their Black riders are female, so it's largely women of color who are still on the bus. And in markets that have a significant Spanish-speaking customer base, the Spanish-speaking ridership dropped a tiny, tiny fraction of what the English-speaking ridership dropped. So I think all of that sort of paints the picture of where we're at in the midst of the shutdown, and what the post-COVID world looks like is, you know, we're in a situation where the CDC had given guidance maybe last week or even earlier this week that they didn't advise using public transit as a mode to safely get to work. So we have some big challenges to overcome to A, make transit actually safe, and then B, overcome the perception of a lack of safety on public transit. And at the same time, you know, the MTA in New York City has had 132 or more than 132 at this point employees die of COVID-19. Is very, very, very real.
So you think it's going to take some time for the public to, in other words, there's been a perception that transit is dangerous.
Yeah, and I think there's interesting studies out of countries where SARS was a big concern in the early 2000s. In the city of Beijing, bus riderships never rebounded to pre-SARS level, in part because there was a huge surge in vehicle purchases. But the situation there is complicated by the fact that they were also building out their subway lines at the same time, and that influenced bus ridership as well.
Okay. Shankari, what do you think the post-COVID world in transit will be?
So, I mean, I echo a lot of what Alana just said in terms of transit ridership dropping. As far as we can make out, the transit ridership drop has been coupled with an increase in active transportation in terms of biking and so on. And I don't know how transit can maybe support that better in some way. So, you know, Andy had brought up smaller vehicles is one of his questions. Now let him go further into that. But I mean, one option might be to maybe have vehicles that are smaller, so you're around fewer people, or something where you get close to, you know, one person per vehicle, but you also make the vehicle more efficient and smaller in some ways. The other thing I just sort of wanted to bring up in case people were interested was, as part of Elena talking about how to make transit safer, we've also been looking at whether transit can work with public health to help with contact tracing. So I'm sure all of you have heard of contact tracing. Now it's this thing where you have to public health authorities try to figure out everybody who was in contact with a patient, and then, you know, tell them either go get tested, or, you know, if you were there for an hour or something, then just quarantine yourself because the chances are very high that you're also infected. So we haven't found a lot of guidelines that talk about how these two public agencies should work together. And so we're trying to conduct some surveys and see, you know, what is actually going on. Are they cooperating and we just don't know it? Or are they not cooperating, and is there something we can do to make that collaboration actually work? So if you're interested in talking to us about that, I'd love to talk to you at some point.
Okay, thank you. Andy?
I think that the current pandemic is going to likely shape things fairly substantially in the near future, and then maybe more substantially as time goes on. From my connections at various transit agencies and with APTA, I've learned that some of the key desires right now among transit operators are to have a touchless interface. The ability for people to be ticketed through maybe an app to get on a bus or a train to make their journey and to exit without really the need to either interact with a driver or a common shared interface of some sort. Beyond that, we, even prior to the pandemic, had been looking at the interest among transit agencies of changing their vehicle types for certain routes, maybe right-sizing vehicles or having on-demand vehicles that serve an area rather than a route. I see this as maybe being a viable mid to longer term step for transit agencies, and being able to kind of tailor the implementation of their services that would align more closely with the needs of their passengers, and possibly even do it more efficiently from an energy and cost perspective than current iterations. So I think this is again, you know, an opportunity. I probably won't get the quote quite exactly right, but never waste a good crisis to come up with better solutions. In other words, kind of making lemonade out of lemons to find a new and better implementation for transit through the challenges that we're now facing. And I think we're at an inflection point as a society where people are seeing that less driving and cleaner air and other benefits are closely associated with making different mobility choices. And maybe as a society, we have some leverage there to help to shift people toward better choices, while at the same time improving mobility options for people who traditionally haven't had many options. In a lot of places, transit is not well utilized by the general population, and there's a tendency among people who have fewer choices to gravitate toward transit. And if we can improve that experience for them and improve access to jobs or other opportunities, groceries, whatever it may be, that's where we can, I think, position transit as a viable solution to what we're now facing.
Yeah, we know that before we got on the call, Elena was talking about values and how that impacts or influences the decisions and the choices we make. What do you do in the situation where people really do value environmental sustainability, but they still don't choose, less, they still don't choose environmentally sustainable modes of transit? It seems like a sort of cognitive dissonance there when that happens. I mean, this is kind of a jump ball. If anybody wants to answer that, raise your hand.
I'll jump on it. It's a bit of the do as I say, not as I do approach. And I think that I don't want to generalize by any means, but I think people who have choices in mobility may kind of preach toward desirable outcomes, expecting others to follow them, and they are less willing to actually shift their behavior toward what they may have identified as the public good. That's something that has broader societal and cultural roots as to how it's developed. I see Shankari with a raised hand. I want to make sure that she's included here.
Okay. Go ahead, Shankari.
So the study that I talked about earlier that the undergraduates did had some results that may shed a little bit of light on this. I want to say it was only 50 people, very preliminary, was conducted by undergraduates and so on, but it was a randomized control trial, which is sort of the gold standard. We had a control group and an information group and an emotion group. And what they found was that the people with the emotion group were more engaged with the app. Like, they felt like, oh, we need to do something about this, like we care about it and so on, but they didn't actually change their behavior a lot. And the people with the information group, in which they would basically give people suggestions on how to change their behavior to be more sustainable, they actually changed their behavior, but they uninstalled the app more quickly. So it's like they didn't like to be told what to do in some sense. I don't know where to generalize from that, but I just thought that might be an interesting point to discuss and see whether other people feel like that resonates with them too.
Elena? Or
Yeah, I think there's a couple studies that have used the randomized control trial method that Shankari mentioned, that in terms of the results being just more reliable. Two I really like are, one is from Durham, North Carolina, where their goal was to reduce drive alone rates to their downtown core by 5%, which, if you've worked at all in transportation demand management or in mode choice changes, 5% is huge. It's almost unfathomable. And they did sort of a two-pronged approach where they gave folks very detailed route planning information about, what are your options for taking transit, walking, biking, helping people really reflect on the time that they spend that's stressful, either in congestion or trying to find parking or paying for parking. So that was sort of one angle. And among the several thousand participants, they got a 12% reduction in drive alone rates just with these customized alternative trip planning, where they also had offered like one-on-one coaching. Like you could have a consultation with somebody to understand how to make these different mode choices. And then the second piece that they did was sort of an economic incentive where they created a lottery or if you rode transit, you were eligible for a weekly cash prize drawing. And that, for folks who were in both the sort of information and the lottery group, they cut drive alone rates 16%, which is incredible. The city of Chicago, they've also a cool study was done to try to reduce congestion on nights when there were sports games of some sort. Apologies for not recalling the variety, but they tested a bunch of different messaging, like just information, or doing a cash donation to a charity, or doing a fare rebate, like giving you a free transit ticket. And they found that giving people a free transit pass was more effective than making a charitable contribution on their behalf or just giving them information. So there are all kinds of cool experiments that can be done with these kinds of incentives. And I think that VIA is actually, with your sort of renewable electrified transit model, could be a really neat example for testing messaging around like truly sustainable green mobility, and if that can influence mode choice.
I just want to add to that a little bit. I was part of a project sponsored by the Department of Energy's ARPA-E program, focused on using a mobility app to shift people away from SOV trips to a variety of different potential outcomes, but in general to try to improve their energy efficient mobility choices. And the gamification elements that were included in that app were actually pretty substantial motivators as compared to information about how green they might be by making that choice. It comes down to kind of human nature and competition. Even though they were competing for almost valueless points, it's kind of human nature to try to be at the top of the heap, to try to do better than your colleagues. And so that might be a place where using gamification in pushing behavioral nudges, especially with regard to transit use in conjunction with a commute or other regularly made trips, might be something that is appealing. Say, for example, having different departments within an organization compete with each other and have some sort of reward to whoever comes out on top. But the idea is along the lines of what Shankari was noting, that people don't like to be told what to do. They like to derive their own internal motivation for their behaviors. It's possible to shape those behaviors and shape those motivations externally, but it can't be in an overt way. Part of the work that I did with Denver B-Cycle, we found that showing users that they're saving the environment by X% or improving their health by whatever were less compelling than just stressing the fun and competition aspects of participation.
Yeah, actually, Elaine, I'm curious about your insights on this from the Love to Ride Challenge and other folks that might have experience and insights on the local scene here.
Yeah, thanks for pulling me in, because I was just thinking about how, Love to Ride is one of those platforms. It's just really positive, fun to use, and we saw success using that scenario because that is originally based on go out, ride your bike for 5 minutes. So anybody who hadn't ridden a bicycle in a long time, it was an easy lift. Just try it. And their structure has been very good about let's move you up the platform. But the funny thing is, this being Boulder, if I was dealing with companies with young people, they were like, yeah, this is great. And then I called up Naropa one day, and this was the last thing that they wanted to do, was be competitive about it. So sometimes you just recognize different targets, because in Naropa, they maybe did have a little more incentive to do do something like use sustainable transportation because it's the right thing to do. It's good for all of us, the environment, but we don't want to compete.
Different messages for different audiences, and
Exactly.
you bring up kind of the differences in demography, and certainly for those with young children at home that need to get them to daycare or school or wherever they need to be, encounter different challenges than
Mhm.
maybe a single person that has a lot more flexibility. And so the messaging around how to shift those behaviors really does need to be tailored for a specific audience. And as Elena mentioned, if there's a possibility of coaching or individualization of advice, that can have better returns as well.
I'm glad you brought up gamification because that seems to work in so many realms. um, so I'm going to ask one more question and then kind of open it up. And since we're a small enough group, I think people could just bring up topics and ask questions directly. Um, the question I'm going to ask right now is, what smaller to mid-sized cities do you know of or have you visited where you might be comfortable living without a car? What would it take for Boulder to be one of those places? And the panel can answer it, but also, you know, people in the audience, if you have some, our other attendees, if you have any thoughts about that, please join in. Does anybody want to start it off? Andrea?
I can.
Oh, okay, Debbie.
I've been doing it now for 4 years, using VIA as my only transportation. The thing that I would say would make it more beneficial is to be able to have the evening, because it leaves me out of plays, theater, anything that would be that social activity of the evening. That's the one thing that I really, really miss that I don't get to do anymore. So that would, you know, if I were, and again, I recognize that's just the reality of me living with a disability. But if I were the person not living with a disability, I would not give up my car to throw away my evenings that way. So I would need some kind of beneficial way to make evenings work safely. And I know we have like the buses for the people that can, you know, ride the regular buses and things like that, but I don't hear a lot of positives about those situations.
Anybody else?
Yeah, I'd just like to jump in. I have a little bit of a question in what role zoning plays. Because most places I've been that are very walkable, let's say Amsterdam, let's say Guanajuato, Mexico, Portland, Oregon, even, they're mixed. Everything is jumbled up together. Disneyland, we all hear about Disneyland famously scaling down to, you know, 3/4 scale. So I'm just curious, you know, if Boulder were to move in that direction, what role zoning would play, because if people have to go long distances to get hot sauce or something small, that's a time barrier. You know, what could be a 5-minute trip in Goose Hollow of Portland is suddenly a 2-hour trip. So yeah, I'm just curious about what role zoning would play and if that's something that is approachable. Or, you know, I also understand that people have had home values go up very, very high, especially if they got in early. So that's sort of an attack on their wealth, potentially.
When you say zoning, do you mean like the green belt around the city of Boulder?
No. I mean lot size. I mean the size
Okay.
of the homes. I mean the size of, I mean the fact that the Euclidean sort of zoning structure, the fact that this part of town is where people live and this part of town is where people work, and along this street is where the house, you know, and like if somebody wanted to open up a toilet paper shop out of their house, it would be a little bit difficult. Or, you know, if like having, like a lot of these places I've gone, it's mixed use, I guess, more mixed use and less single use within itself. I'm curious about that, you know, and then also parking. because they're related.
You're
And I
right.
know I know I'm
The two
touching on
most
sensitive
toxic
subjects here.
topics in Boulder.
Oh, are they really toxic? Oh, I've only been here a year, and I just go into
um,
Boulder and come home, and I'm like, why can't I live in Boulder? And I'm looking at it, and these are the things I'm looking to. So,
I mean, you hit the nail on the head. Like, land use is at the heart, like the core, the essence of what we're talking about when we're talking about mobility choices. Like, you can't choose to walk, and you can't choose to bike, and you can't choose to ride the bus if you don't live close enough to walk, or if it's not safe to bike, or if you don't live close enough to bike. And for transit, you need a certain population density, and you need a certain destination density for it to really work, really well and elegantly the way that it does in other communities. And it doesn't quite in Boulder. I've heard the stat that, and I don't know if this is true, but I wouldn't be surprised that 83% of the land area that's designated for housing in Boulder is zoned single family. And so we have, for a huge swath of the city area, we have a sort of suburban feel, like Martin Acres, South Boulder, other huge neighborhoods. I lived in a neighborhood where it's like questionably walkable to a grocery store. And the city has goals for 15-minute neighborhoods. And there are people here who probably know a lot more than I do about if we're making any progress towards that. I'm not sure.
I just want to.
I will put in one quick plug for housing in Boulder. I'm working on a campaign to reform our occupancy limits. It's currently illegal for more than 3 unrelated people to live together. Even if you have a 4-bedroom house, if your renter's not in a high density zone, like, sorry. But we have a campaign to change that to let at least one person live in every bedroom. And our campaign is at www.bedroomsareforpeople.com.
So I think that there are cities that have removed zoning restrictions in the US. I forget which one right now. Was it Minneapolis? Yeah. I was thinking it was Minneapolis, but then Minneapolis has certain other connotations right now, so I wasn't sure if I was missing that. And it would be interesting to see if what happens over the 5 to 10 year period there. But I agree with Elena that land use is just so politically toxic that it's going to be a very heavy lift. So I'm actually in California. They're working remotely because of COVID-19 and everything. And so California has state level goals for greenhouse gas emissions. And there have been 2 attempts to introduce land use bills as a vehicle to address those, and they have both failed, including in the parts of the state where you would expect them to have the greatest support.
I wanted to jump back quickly and acknowledge Debbie's comment related to mobility and for people with disabilities. It's not directly related to land use, but we've identified that as a kind of maybe the lowest hanging fruit where both convenience can be improved and energy efficiency can be improved. And identifying that I'm certainly not a specialist in this area, but that there are alternatives that have recently emerged for mobility services for disabled communities that are not approved by governing bodies that support disabled mobility options. So I don't have the answers right now, but that's something that I wanted to acknowledge that is in our purview and something that we're trying to work within our group for solutions.
Well, and I would add that, I think that's, ask Debbie and Brian to reflect on that as well. I think that's truly our founding mission, quite frankly, is providing that ability for people who have a limitation of some kind, whether it's permanent or it's temporary, and whatever the range of that is, for them to have the ability to access the community for things like jobs and recreation and really a whole host of subject areas, topic areas, and make that be very seamless and have it not be a separate, set apart element of the community transit network. I don't think we're quite there from that philosophical standpoint, but that's certainly our primary objective, is to provide that. Having said that, we know at VIA, our board does very well, that it's a very expensive service for a lot of reasons. It is around the country very expensive. Nonetheless, we have to continue to work towards enhancing those choices, but I would say as well for VIA and for our community, we need to make certain that we're looking at transportation, transit in a broader perspective. I can tell you that at VIA, in addition to our paratransit program, we provide fixed route and commuter shuttle type service. And we are currently the home of Ego Car Share. They live with us at VIA. And Peter Cranball and I have been exploring the idea of a merger between our two entities. And why would we do that? It's not just for space saving or efficiency. It really is because when you look at transportation today, transportation tomorrow, the notion of eliminating or reducing the number of single occupant vehicles is going to take more than just transit. And it's, certainly Andrew mentioned B-cycle. I think that would be another element, but everyone is differently abled across the board. And there's no way with some issues I have that I could cycle to work, but others can. So we just have to make sure we're providing as a community a range of options. And I think to Alana's point and Andrew's point, we here in Boulder, we've done a pretty good job over the years of building land use and transit-oriented developments into this community. I think we're doing a better and better job with that. One of the things I don't think exists today is that ability, as Andrew was saying, is to go get the hot sauce, within a few minutes away. That still is a shortcoming of our zoning system, but it's in place, and very high standards for energy efficiency and greenhouse gas reduction exist in Boulder and many, many, many cities in the U.S. So I think we're doing a good job. Obviously much room for growth in that area, and I would also reflect on the fact that Andrea Menegal is on our Zoom as well, down at the bottom of our Hollywood Squares here. And I think we have a Chamber of Commerce that is really uniquely oriented with community, advocating for business, but advocating for the community and advocating for these types of services and choices. So plenty more to do, but we're doing more than many places, and we have a good start.
Thanks, Frank. Debbie?
Just another point I thought of in terms of if we expand that way is the extra costs of whatever that may look like in terms of the bus stops, the safety of the bus stops, the lighting, the bike racks that hold the person before they get to the bus, like all of those things. I was on the committee, Transportation for All Mobility, for a year last year, and that was one of the biggest complaints that I heard over and over again from people, whether they had disabilities or not, if they were just aging or just someone without any of those issues, was the how to safely wait for the bus service or the transportation service, whatever that was.
Mm-hmm.
I would just like to add to that one of the biggest mobility challenges that I think we're facing is the aging of our population, the baby boomer generation, many of whom have depended on personal privately owned cars much of their lives will be aging out of the ability to drive, and will likely be looking to transit or other mobility options that, frankly, at this point probably don't have the capacity to serve that large piece of the population that will be in need of something approaching disabled service, even if it is not by definition. So that's a huge piece that we are going to need to address in the very near future. I work on a group of projects surrounding rural mobility, and the proportion of people in that highest age group in a rural setting is higher even than in urban settings. And those are the people with the least mobility choices, generally speaking, outside of private vehicle ownership. And so as a nation, this is something that we will have to be able to address one way or another. Thinking about Boulder County, much of the population is in Boulder, but there is also a kind of a dispersed element throughout the rest of the county that is probably not currently well served by transit because of design and or costs associated with that. But this is where we're really going to have to be thinking outside of the norm to try to address those challenges.
Thank you. I think I'm going to ask this question of our researchers. As communities wrestle with tough choices to balance between competing transportation needs, what kind of data can help ensure that the decisions incentivize socially desired behavior? In other words, what questions do we need more answers to? Where is the data lacking right now? Anybody want to go first? Any opinions?
This was my question, and this was my question. So I was hoping to actually hear from the other participants
Or the audience.
Chuck?
In Boulder, we've seen perhaps a high bar for data to support decision making, and a high bar means high costs because collecting data costs money. So somewhere there is a beautiful balance, but it doesn't mean that that beautiful balance will generate public buy-in. And so it's a really complex dance that's probably more political than scientific.
I'll just add to that we currently, in part due to tools like have been developed by people like Shankari, provide us insight into people's behavior in a way that wasn't even possible a few years ago. But there are privacy concerns associated with that type of data. There are a number of different hurdles that have to be cleared to be able to even collect travel and behavioral data. That said, I think it continues to be an opportunity, because 10 or 15 years ago, wondering about individual trips and why they were made and what the mode choice was, the rationale behind it, was something that we could think about and maybe engage a small population via travel diaries or something. But now we have the possibility of collecting broad data through phone apps that can help inform policy and practice to a degree that wasn't even imagined back then. It's just a matter of sifting through what's most useful, what's worth fighting for, and going for it, and helping to modernize some of the research processes, including approval for data collection that we face, that those of you who aren't researchers might not even be aware of.
Yeah, Lisa, can you hear me? I'd like to respond
Yeah, I can hear
to
you.
Andre. I was thinking, going back to the topic of the day, and to not be, tone deaf. I realize we have academic service providers, and riders all in the room. But the question has been about behavior change, and then now data that's missing. So, what comes to mind for me, given COVID and however long it takes us to get past this era, and Andrea and I were chatting about this a little bit yesterday, relating to data, is it really comes around to essential, workers. And I feel like what's missing right now is, do we understand what those essential employers are, and who their employees, what are those mobility needs? And that goes back to data, because of the anonymized data sources that we can get to and evaluate that over the last couple of months as everybody's, safer at home. So that data perspective is there. And then the other thing that I would, that comes to mind for the academics in the room is to really consider that, getting back on the bus is going to be a challenge. We should think about this in choice riders and transit dependent riders. If I'm looking at MTA and I'm looking at New Jersey Transit, I realize totally different scale of a system. They're running full service almost again. I'm not saying their ridership is back to that level, but in cities that have prioritized transit, there are just, 50% of their population, let's say, are transit dependent. So I think that's a very different context than, what we're trying to solve out here in the middle of the country often, other than some of the major city hubs, are those choice riders. And when we're talking behavior change, those are the choice riders. I feel like we just need to focus on the transit dependent folks, make sure these systems are working for them. When we have those, volumes in place, it helps us to subsidize those small rides, or the one-off rides, as opposed to, the shared rides of, 80 folks on the bus trying to get back from Denver. I think where we end up here in the very near term is that prioritize, high frequency bus rapid transit type routes. I realize that's not Via's game, but we connect with those routes. That's priority. And sadly, I think what probably suffers is the coverage routes for, regional transit or city transit. But the question that Andrea and I were talking about is, what is the cost to serve those coverage routes anyway with big buses that are, mostly empty? And where can we step in with the on-demand services, that Via provides, and see if we can't do that cheaper than, the regional buses do that are, running around with empty buses because nobody's getting on there, but, we're paying for those. So there's that. And then, just while I have the floor for a moment, and the academics as well, and this is something that's not studied, but on a hike or a run last year way up in the Arapahoes, it finally occurred to me that, behavior change is so incredibly difficult. A lot of it comes through shaming on one side, right? I mean, this is smoking in the restaurants or on the street. This is, recycling bin, out front, the tier of the Native American and litter, all of that in the shaming side. But it occurred to me that really what we're trying to accomplish is, think about a product or service marketer. We've got to go find customers, not convince people how to change. And so I just kind of offer up this construct that when you can solve a pain, people will pay for that all day long. So, where we have congestion, if we can get people there faster, that's solving a pain. So if we can solve a pain, we've got a customer and they'll pay. If we can make access convenient, and I'm thinking Uber apps to, car share instead of waiting forever for a taxi that doesn't show up. If we make that convenient, people will pay for it frequently. And when we get to that point, then we can start worrying about driving down the cost. I just think often we're looking at these things of let's change behavior and we have to make it cheap. And I just kind of want to flip that and say, let's go solve a problem. We know people will pay for solving a problem. And then how do we make that access convenient? So a couple of different constructs there that you guys just have, spinning in my mind related to behavior change and the folks that have been really deep. I mean, I'm a neophyte. I mean, I'm a neophyte to transit operations, but I've been dedicated. When I moved to Boulder and realized you can live your life without a car, on a bicycle. I mean, that's taken me all the way to, you know, single car ownership while living up in the mountains with a couple of babies, and, you know, hitching rides and skateboards and buses, you know, all over the Metroplex in multiple states. So, you know, at some point in time, when you get that behavior change, you know, you're committed. But I realize I just want to admit that I'm a neophyte when it comes to the challenges of operating and funding, you know, transit and increasing ridership. It's incredibly difficult.
Frank, you want to address that?
Sure. I agree with Chuck. Those are good points. I'm really impressed that you could make those choices, especially that picturing the skateboard and in the mountains. But
It wasn't
No,
pretty.
easy.
But I think that, you know, you're right about once you get change, it's a lot easier. And this is a great example, I think, that we're using Zoom for this session. And, you know, frankly, if we could have been in person, it would have been fun, would have been great, but it probably would have been much harder to schedule it, to organize it, and for people to be there. And so, you know, I kind of feel like this is, you know, while some things will be back to in person, this is not a bad thing for us to continue to be able to connect like this. And hopefully the platforms will become more stable and we'll be able to, you know, do a better job of being connected if it's this way. But I think this is a good example of behavioral change that I think will stick because people have experienced it in a way, and we're compelled to do it in a lot of ways, but we've tried it. So I think
Right.
taking transit, not because it's dangerous in normal times, but because it's inconvenient and the weather may change, and, you know, so any number of things. But I think you're right that if we could move to a more on-demand platform with even what are now fixed routes, so modified fixed routes with more of an on-demand focus, that I think will help bring that change because it'll just be more convenient. If I could walk out my door tomorrow morning and jump on a shuttle that would even take me to a more efficient linked spot with fixed route, that would be great. And I probably would change behavior immediately. And talking with Peter from Ego this afternoon, we were saying, you know, if we had a network of more car share vehicles, and Peter's data shows that for every one car share trip, you can eliminate 13 privately owned vehicles. That's, you know, all of this becomes very potent. So thank you, Chuck. I think that was great for you to share, and I thank you for doing that.
Well, thanks, everyone. I don't like to go over because I think it's because it's better to keep to an hour. So I'm going to go ahead and wrap up here. Thank you so much to our participants, our panelists who came today, and everybody who participated in the conversation. We do this at 5 o'clock on the first Thursday of every month. If you have any ideas for topics that we'd like for us to discuss, please shoot me an email or shoot Natalie Stifler an email. She's our Director of Operations. I think many of you know her as well, or send one to Frank as well. So we thank you for joining. I look forward to seeing everyone again at a future first Thursday. Thanks so much.
Thanks, Lisa.
Thanks, everybody.
Bye.
Thanks, Lisa.
Yeah, thanks for the opportunity.
Oh, thank you.
Yeah, it was fun. Thanks. Good conversation.
Thanks.